In today's how-to video, I'm gonna explain how I conduct my dry fire. This question actually comes from one of the subscribers who sent me a message and asked me to make a video on how I do my dry fire, and I'll explain when I do it, how I do it, which process I use, and which techniques I train in which fashion. Obviously, live fire training and live fire matches are the most fun to do in our sports. But to get really good in our sport, I think it's absolutely necessary to also engage in dry fire training at home in a safe environment and under safe conditions. I think it's essential to improve your skill set and improve also your results and ranking. If you look at, for example, the dry fire playlist on my channel, you will find dozens of dry fire videos of people explaining how they do the dry fire, showing it to you, explaining it to you. I don't think there's a best way to conduct dry fire if you do it qualitatively correct. Now, what do I mean by that? Doing dry fire, but you don't analyze yourself, you don't criticize yourself, you do not record yourself in real time, or for example using a video, then it becomes very difficult to detect possibilities for you to improve, or possibilities where you see that you are doing something incorrect, which might lead to, in worst case scenario, if you do this in a live fire setting, to a dangerous situation and or in a match lead to a DQ. In best case scenario, you will lose valuable fractions of seconds and maybe even seconds on your stage because you do not execute a technique correctly, or you always have to operate from your conscious mind and not from your subconscious mind. So if you want to find out more information on dry firing, I would refer to my dry fire playlist on my channel, or there are multiple books out there from very good shooters that you can buy and consult, in which they have regimes in their processes, they have a lot of theory and so on and so on. If you want to find out more about the books, I actually have a section where I discuss according to me, the best books available, also describing dry fire, and it's in the discussions section on my YouTube channel. Now, obviously, I'm not a pro shooter, so I really don't have time to spend the entire day on a range. I'm limited. In these COVID times, for example, the ranges, all the local ranges are closed, so the only thing we have is actually the dry fire setting. For me, to be able to combine my passion for practical shooting and to upkeep and improve my skills, what is manageable for me is I train 3 times per week for approximately 30 minutes. I have a fixed dry fire routine which I go through and which I will actually explain later on in the video. Not only which technique, but also how I conduct it, and I will briefly show it to you also. So 3 times per week, 30 minutes I use to dry fire. Once, or maybe in best case scenario twice per month, I will actually use my airsoft gear to really set up a stage or to improve a specific technique in which I want to have feedback on my shots. And that's one of the benefits of also having airsoft IPSC equipment, that it's safe because you shoot off BBs and you get direct results on the targets because you see where you actually shot. I will later on make a video on how I integrate and how I use my airsoft gear and guns into my training to improve my live fire IPSC skills and techniques, but that's something for a later video. And I have two modes in which I do the dry fire training, and I fluctuate in between them. I have the what I call the technical mode, in which I really focus not on speed but on the correct execution of the technique, for example, of the draw, of the reload, of the turns. I focus on the technical aspect. So I break down the technique and I will analyze if I execute it correctly, in order obviously to save time. The second mode is what I call the competition mode. In the competition mode, I will actually use a timer. I will use a timer with a par time function on it, so I can really set, for example, for a draw, I can set it to 1.2 seconds, and then at the beep, I have 1.2 seconds to actually draw, to see, can I make it, can I lower it, can I go to 0.8 seconds to my draw, and this is how I push myself on time. And that's what I call the competition mode. And I vary between them. I don't really have a specific structure for that. I use both to make sure that I have a good balance between my technical skills and the technical execution of the techniques I use, and the competition mode to push myself to gain speed. So those are the two modes I use in my training. In the question by the subscriber, he also asked me what gear and equipment I use for my dry fire training. Basically, you need your normal gear, your belt, obviously your gun, your magazines. Obviously, what I really recommend is get a timer, and a timer which has a par time function, so you can set the timer, for example, for 1.2 seconds, 3 seconds or whatever, and it will give a start beep and an ending beep, and this is how you can actually push your speed with the timer keeping you honest and making sure that you are actually within the preset time. Obviously, the lower you can get with your times on the draws, on the reloads, on the transitions, the turns, and so on, the better. I recommend to start from a reasonable time and then work your way down. And if you are working your way down, you can actually push yourself, but don't work upwards. So start with a reasonable time and then work your way down. The dry fire is not something that you do just to do it, but it's to train and improve. And initially, when I first got into the sports, I actually used a full-length mirror to observe the different techniques real time in the mirror. But now I've been evolving through the sports. I actually use GoPro cameras from different angles. You can use any other camera, but that gives you very interesting feedback, either also in real time if you want to observe yourself when you did something, or later on when you have some time, instead of surfing generally on the internet, that you can actually observe and look at a couple of your videos to see what are the things you did well and what are the things where you can improve on. So recording yourself in a dry fire setting with a camera is also very, very valuable, and that actually helped me a lot, not only in the dry fire setting, but I also use the cameras during my live fire training as well as my matches. And the objective is not to make videos to then publish them on YouTube. The primary reason why I record myself is to self-analyze, auto-analyze myself, to see what I did well and where I can improve on. Very, very valuable. Much more than the feedback you can receive from your fellow competitors. And especially because you can repeat it, and there's always things that you can learn from it. So if you have the resources, I would say invest in 1 or 2 cameras. And record yourself in a dry fire setting, as well as live fire training, and also at matches. Another piece of equipment I use, actually I have multiple, but I mean you go as far as you want in that. You have these small IPSC-USPSA targets representing long distance that you can place somewhere. You can fix them, or you can use them in a mobile fashion. Or as I have here, I have different stands where I have targets on, and I have large targets, we have small targets, we have mini IPSC targets. Here in Europe and Belgium, we don't use USPSA type targets, so we only use the IPSC models. So this is the 60% version. I have the mini one, and then the large one like I have here, and I mount them. I have stands, I can vary with them. I also have a swinger, for example, but this is something you don't really need the stands. If you have a couple of targets and you can mount them somewhere next to the wall, that's perfectly fine. So having a couple of targets at your availability is always useful, also to do your transitions, for example. One of the questions that might arise is it useful to make, if you have a reloading station, to make dummy rounds with no primers and no powder in it, or to buy a couple of dummy rounds? There are multiple ones available. I have to say, I actually bought a very long time ago dummy rounds that I initially used, but I don't use dummy rounds anymore in my training. I don't find them very useful. If you are worried about damaging your firing pin, there's also a video on my YouTube channel in a playlist which is called Handgun Maintenance, that discusses the pros and cons of dry firing with dummy rounds, the different types of dummy rounds, in which type of trigger mechanism it's better to use dummy rounds, and so on and so on. So if you want to use dummy rounds, I would say go for it. I personally don't use them anymore at this point in time. I have a fixed program that I use to do my dry fire training. It constitutes of 6 techniques I train, subdivided, and I train each technique for 5 minutes, and each subsection each time for 1 minute. And the order is always the same. The first technique I train is the draw. The second technique I train is the loading and reloading. The third technique I train is the turns, left, right, and 180. The fourth technique I train is the drop step technique for explosive starts. The fifth technique I train is the technique of moving into a position, left, right, front, back. And the final technique I train is transitions. Training my eye and my gun to follow, and making sure that I can move fast from one target to another. So these are the 6 techniques I integrate in my standard dry fire training. And I will explain each one separately. Subsections, 1 minute each, so I do get an important quantity of draws if I do this consecutively. And the first is 1 minute. I draw my gun freestyle, loaded and holstered. So I draw and I want to get into the right position. And for 1 minute, I will actually do this. After 1 minute, my timer goes off and I shift to the second option, in which the magazine is inserted, but there's no round chambered. So this is the second technique I use in the draw section. And then I actually pull, load, and engage. And I will actually do this also for 1 minute. After the second minute, I go to the third minute. The third minute is unloaded, again, load, charge, and engage. This I'll do for 1 minute. The last 2 minutes I use for strong hand, draw and shooting. So the final 2 minutes I use for strong hand shooting and weak hand shooting. So loaded gun, I will use the right technique to actually engage for 1 minute. And then the same thing, last 1 minute, weak hand shooting, same thing. And engage for 1 minute. So this is my first segment of 5 minutes. The second segment is dedicated to reloading. And here I reload from a static position 1 minute, then 1 minute moving forwards. I will continuously, while moving forwards, start to reload. The third section, the third subsection, the third minute, I actually go from left to right, right to left, and then backwards. So 5 different ways of loading, reloading my gun, each time practicing for 1 minute. The next technique I train for 5 minutes are the turns. 1 minute and a half turning from the left to the downrange location. Same thing, 1 minute and a half from the right to the downrange location. And last, 180 turning to the downrange location. 2 minutes. So in total 5 minutes. Left turns, right turns, 180 turns during 5 minutes. The next technique I practice is the drop step technique. Also for a period of 5 minutes, in 1 minute increments, I will actually train the drop step technique, and I'll refer to another video on my YouTube channel for a detailed explanation, but I will actually practice the drop step technique going to the right, the drop step technique of going to the right, to the left, the drop step technique of going forward, and also the drop step technique of going backwards. And I will do this for 5 minutes in 1 minute increments. The next technique I practice is the technique of moving into a position. Also here, you don't need a lot of space. I will actually practice going forwards, going to the left, going to the right, and moving backwards to train myself to get my gun up right at the moment when I enter my shooting position, might be a box or a general area, to actually engage. And I will practice this also for 5 minutes, going forwards, backwards, left, and right. And the last technique I train is the transition technique, in which I actually practice transitioning fast from one target to the other. The objective of this training is to train my eyes to fast go from one target to another. And here, for example, I would use this, go back and train this for 5 minutes. It's possible that I will vary the orientation and the number of targets, but for 5 minutes, the only thing I do is transition. Not shoot, not load, charge, or anything like that. It's training your eye, making sure that your gun follows to transition fast in between different targets. And I also do this for 5 minutes. And that will complete my dry fire training. I have 6 techniques I train each time for 5 minutes. And that constitutes my normal dry fire training, which I conduct 3 times per week. I really recommend that you take notes because there's always something that you observe that you can correct. Maybe you don't have time to really work on it in that particular dry fire training session, but if you know that down, that's something you can integrate for later on. Or if you find something that you say, damn, this actually helps me, either from a mental perspective or from a technical perspective, take notes. Because if you train oftentimes and you don't take notes, you forget a lot of things. So I really suggest and recommend that if you do dry fire training as well as live fire training and even matches, try to take note of the things that work very well for you and the things that you can work on, the things that you have observed from other shooters that you can actually incorporate into your next dry fire or live fire training.
Moving like the speed of sound. Feet can't keep on the ground. Can't stay in one place.